It was a Saturday night like any other in early January. The air in Knoxville, Tennessee, carried a winter chill, the kind that nudged people indoors or into their cars, off the street, and into warm company. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that most people find comforting in a suburban southern town. A few lights flickered in windows. The hum of televisions buzzed softly behind drawn curtains. For many, it was a night to relax, to wind down from the first week of the new year. For Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, it was a night like many others in their young love story. Channon, just 21 years old, was a student at the University of Tennessee. She had a future full of promise. Intelligent, radiant, and deeply rooted in her Christian faith, she was the kind of daughter every parent hopes for. Her family adored her, and her friends spoke of her with the kind of admiration reserved for people who shine just a little brighter than the rest. Chris Newsom, 23, was athletic, kind, and devoted, a former high school baseball standout with dreams still forming. His easy charm and confident smile made him well-liked by everyone who knew him. He came from a tight-knit family, too, one that supported him, loved him, and looked forward to what the future would bring. He and Channon had been dating for only a short time, but the connection between them had grown quickly. Steady, sincere, and full of the quiet excitement that comes from finding something real. That night, they planned something simple. A dinner date. No extravagant plans. No flashy destinations. Just each other. Channon parked her Toyota 4Runner at a friend's apartment in the Washington Ridge complex, a quiet, relatively safe area of Knoxville. The couple sat together in the vehicle, talking, laughing, maybe listening to music. These were their final moments of peace, moments where the world still made sense, where evil was still a distant concept, where the idea that something horrifying could happen, here, to them, would have felt unthinkable. But evil doesn't announce itself. It doesn't warn. It doesn't knock. It waits, lurking in the cracks of the world, and sometimes it steps out without reason or mercy. That night, it stepped into the lives of Channon and Chris in the form of 5 strangers. Somewhere nearby was Lamarcus Davidson, recently released from prison and already steeped in criminal behavior, was planning something. With him were Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd. They were armed, and were cruising for opportunity, not for money or survival, but something darker, something fueled by power, dominance, and cruelty. Davidson, the alpha among them, had been living at 2316 Chipman Street, a rundown rental home not far from where Channon and Chris had parked. In that house, the stage had already been set. Just after 8 p.m., that quiet night turned deadly. The group spotted the 4Runner and its unsuspecting occupants. Something about the sight of the young couple, clean-cut, well-dressed, innocent, seemed to spark the urge. What was supposed to be a simple dinner date turned, without warning, into a life-altering tragedy. The attackers moved in, swift and coordinated. Within moments, the car was surrounded. What happened in those first few seconds inside the vehicle will never be fully known. There were no surviving witnesses. But what we do know, from later testimony, forensic evidence, and the condition in which their bodies were found, is that Channon and Chris were overpowered at gunpoint, forced into the back of the SUV, and driven into a nightmare. Imagine the fear, the panic, the confusion. One moment, you're sitting beside the person you love, maybe talking about school or baseball or your weekend plans, and the next, you're staring down the barrel of a gun. You're being screamed at, touched, controlled, separated from everything familiar. No sirens, no help, just darkness, and the sound of your own breath quickening as your world begins to collapse. Inside the car, Chris likely did what any man in love might do, try to protect her. Channon, maybe trying to calm him, maybe pleading, maybe praying. There's no script for such moments. Only raw terror. The journey from Washington Ridge to Chipman Street was only a few miles. But it was enough time to contemplate death. To wonder what was coming. To hope it wasn't as bad as it seemed. They didn't know what waited inside that house, but by the time the doors closed behind them, it was already too late. The Forerunner, a symbol of normalcy and security, was now tainted, the vehicle of their abduction. It would eventually become a clue, abandoned just blocks from the scene. But for now, it disappeared into the Knoxville night, swallowed by silence. Back in the neighborhood, no one saw. No one knew. No calls were made. And that's one of the most chilling parts of the story. How quickly something so monstrous can happen in plain sight. How thin the line between ordinary and evil really is. It's easy to tell ourselves we would have noticed, that we would have called the police, chased the car, intervened somehow. But Knoxville slept. And by the time the city awoke, 2 families would never be the same again. Lamarcus Davidson, the recently paroled felon, was angry, desperate, and full of hate. He had just lost a job, he was behind on rent, and he had a history of violence that seemed to be escalating. He was accompanied that night by Latalvis Cobbins, his half-brother, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd. The group was not unified by loyalty, but by dysfunction, bound together by criminal ambition, substance abuse, and a shared detachment from morality. At gunpoint, they forced both Chris and Channon out of their seats, likely threatening them with death if they screamed or ran. Inside the Forerunner, they were bound. Channon may have been blindfolded. Chris may have been struck to subdue him. Police later found evidence indicating that the abduction was premeditated, but fueled by opportunity. These weren't hardened criminals executing a grand plan. They were predators reacting to their impulse to dominate. The fear that must have gripped Channon and Chris in that moment is hard to comprehend. One moment, they were having an ordinary conversation. The next, they were being held captive in their own vehicle, completely under the control of strangers whose intentions were, at best, unknown, and at worst, lethal. Chris likely tried to protect Channon. That would have been his instinct. He was athletic, strong, and brave. But no amount of strength could match the reality of multiple assailants with guns. They had no options. No time. No rescue. As the Forerunner drove away, it was no longer a symbol of safety. It had become a mobile prison. Knoxville passed by outside the windows. Quiet neighborhoods, gas stations, streetlights, the ordinary world continuing, blissfully unaware of the horror unfolding in its midst. The car was driven to 2316 Chipman Street, a small rental house tucked into an area already plagued by crime. Davidson was living there, having just been released from a prior stint in prison. The house was poorly maintained, littered with debris, and hidden enough that no one suspected what went on inside. That made it the perfect place for something evil to fester. When the Forerunner pulled up, Channon and Chris were dragged inside. Inside that house, time froze for the victims. They would not leave alive. It's not clear how long they remained in the vehicle before being removed, but once inside the house, the degradation and torture began almost immediately. But for those first minutes, the abduction itself, time likely moved differently. Seconds must have felt like hours. Channon and Chris likely held on to each other, trying to speak comfort to one another even as they were ripped apart, physically and psychologically. What stands out most from this part of the story is the calculated escalation of evil. The suspects could have stopped. They had the vehicle. They could have stolen phones, wallets, even demanded PIN numbers and left the couple alive. But they didn't. They made a choice, a deliberate, sadistic one, to do far more than steal. They made a choice to dehumanize, to torture, and eventually to kill. Eric Boyd, who would later try to minimize his involvement, was in the vehicle during the abduction. His presence was not passive. He was part of the operation from the beginning. He knew what the others intended. The law would eventually catch up with him, but for years he maintained that he was merely a bystander. Once the Forerunner was parked and the couple was inside, the vehicle was cleaned and abandoned just a few blocks away. It was discovered 2 days later, a crucial piece of evidence. Inside were traces of Shannon's belongings. Her purse, her phone, her sense of safety, all left behind like the ghosts of a life that had been stolen. In the hours following the abduction, family and friends began to worry. Channon had not shown up at a friend's house as planned. Chris was no longer answering his phone. It was out of character for both of them, and deeply alarming. Parents began making calls. Texts went unanswered. The silence grew louder. But for Channon and Chris, there was no help coming. They were trapped inside a house no one knew to look for, surrounded by people who had already made up their minds about what would happen next. The moment they got in that car, it was over, one investigator later said. They never stood a chance. It wasn't just a carjacking. It was a hunt. The abduction of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom was not a robbery gone wrong. It was a calculated decision to destroy, carried out by people who saw no humanity in their victims. And what followed inside that house on Chipman Street would become the stuff of nightmares, a descent into darkness so horrific that even seasoned law enforcement officers struggled to speak about it in court. 2316 Chipman Street wasn't just a run-down rental home. It was a trap. Nestled on the city's east side, the house had become a kind of headquarters for Lamarcus Davidson, who, having recently completed a prison sentence, had returned to society with no job, no future, and no remorse. The home itself was unremarkable from the outside: faded siding, sagging steps, a porch littered with discarded items. It was the kind of property you might walk past without a second thought. But inside, it was something else entirely: a den of rot, hopelessness, and soon, horror. The rooms were dimly lit by weak lamps, the windows obscured with blankets or cardboard, shielding everything from outside eyes. A small, stained mattress lay on the floor. Trash crunched underfoot. It wasn't a home. It was a lair. And its occupants were already high on power, drugs, and malice. Lamarcus Davidson controlled the space like a wolf in his den. Aggressive, volatile, and feared even among his accomplices, he asserted his dominance immediately. Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, Vanessa Coleman, and Eric Boyd fell into line behind him, contributing in different degrees to the terror that unfolded. Each would later try to minimize their role. But in that moment, there was no hesitation. The evil was shared. The human body can endure extraordinary pain. But what happened to Christopher Newsom on the night of January 6, 2007, transcends even the bleakest assumptions of cruelty. Inside the walls of 2316 Chipman Street, Chris wasn't simply murdered, he was systematically and savagely broken down. His final hours were a sequence of deliberate dehumanization, not the result of impulse, but of cold, calculated evil. Shortly after Chris and Channon were dragged into the house, the suspects began to separate them. It wasn't random. They wanted control. They wanted to dominate. And in Chris, they likely saw a physical threat, something to neutralize first. He was bound with what would later be identified as fabric and shoelaces. His hands were tied behind his back, and his ankles were also restrained, limiting his ability to resist or flee. The autopsy report, grim and clinical, would later document the horror in detail. Chris had been sodomized repeatedly, likely with both physical and foreign objects. Investigators believe at least 2 or more assailants participated in the assault, and the brutal injuries he sustained in this time reflected an intent not merely to violate, but to shatter his dignity and cause him extreme pain. The acts were not done in haste. They took time. They required coordination. And they served no purpose beyond pure sadism. Then, at some point in the early morning hours of January 7th, his captors decided he was no longer useful. He had served their purpose. They couldn't keep him alive. He had seen their faces. He had heard their voices. So they made him walk. He was led behind a nearby set of railroad tracks, just a few hundred yards from the Chipman Street house. It was there, in the isolation of that desolate spot, that Chris Newsom was executed. He had been shot multiple times, first in the neck, then in the back, and finally in the head. His body was then set on fire, burned so badly that it took time for medical examiners to confirm his identity. The goal was not only to kill, but to erase him, to cover up the evidence, to leave no trace. Back in the house, Channon Christian remained alive, though now utterly alone, her last connection to the outside world extinguished. The terror she must have felt is beyond imagination. For the perpetrators, there was no remorse. There was no second thought. If anything, the crime grew more calculated with time. Davidson began to wipe down the forerunner, cleaning fingerprints. Boyd and Cobbins discussed how to dispose of Chris's body. Others retrieved supplies, bleach, tape, trash bags. Vanessa Coleman, the only woman present, would later testify that she wrote in her journal during the crime, documenting her own experience with detached indifference. This, perhaps, is the most haunting detail: how long it took for anyone to know something was wrong. The crime was not over in minutes. It went on for hours, and Channon was alive through most of it. Her captivity lasted as long as 30 to 36 hours, according to forensic experts. Back at the house, the perpetrators returned to their lair without remorse. They laughed, ate, smoked, cleaned. Davidson allegedly rifled through Chris's clothing before it was destroyed. The sense of triumph, of power, hung in the air. They had killed a man. And now they turned their attention fully to Channon. According to testimony and forensic evidence, Channon was held captive inside the Chipman Street house for approximately 30 to 36 hours. During that time, she was subjected to multiple acts of sexual assault, vaginal, anal, and oral, some of which were so violent that internal injuries later discovered during autopsy could not be explained by normal trauma alone. Medical experts testified that bleach had been poured into her mouth and on her body, a crude attempt by the attackers to destroy DNA evidence and perhaps to prolong her pain. She had been gagged with a sock, her face bruised, and her arms bound tightly behind her back with fabric or shoelaces. She was beaten, raped, and likely moved between rooms in the house. At one point, she may have been restrained inside a bathroom, while Davidson and the others continued their attempts to clean up the crime scene. Eventually, they decided to kill her. But not quickly. Not cleanly. On the second day of her captivity, Channon was forced into 5 large plastic garbage bags, one over her head and others wrapped around her torso and limbs. Her body was then stuffed into a small trash can in the kitchen, a container barely large enough to contain a person. She was left there, bound, gagged, beaten, burned, and still alive. The medical examiner's report revealed that Channon died of asphyxiation. She slowly suffocated, likely over the course of minutes or longer, inside that trash can. The garbage bags restricted her airflow, and the cramped position prevented her from expanding her chest. Later, Davidson and the others would go about their day. They cleaned the house with bleach. They sold Shannon's vehicle, her Toyota 4Runner, for a few dollars to an acquaintance. They partied, smoked weed. Boyd even joked about the murders. Vanessa Coleman, the only female among the group, wrote in her journal during this time, "I've had one hell of an adventure." That quote would later send shockwaves through the courtroom and haunt everyone who heard it. When police finally entered the house 2 days later, tipped off by a call from Shannon's father about her missing vehicle, the smell hit them instantly. A stench of decay, bleach, and human suffering. In the kitchen, they found the trash can, and inside it, curled, bound, and bloated from decomposition, was Channon Christian's body. The medical team who recovered her were hardened professionals, but many had to excuse themselves. Some wept. Some vomited. The scene was unlike anything they had ever witnessed. And yet, from within that horror, they began to piece together what had happened. Shannon's story didn't end in that house. It exploded into courtrooms, headlines, legislative chambers, and the hearts of people across the country. January 9, 2007. It had been nearly 3 full days since Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom vanished without a trace. For their families, those 72 hours were a rising tide of dread. Texts had gone unanswered. Phones had stopped pinging. The kind of worry that starts as a whisper had now become a scream. Something was wrong. Deeply, horrifyingly wrong. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, on the tracks near Whittle Springs, Chris Newsom's body had already been found, burned, shot, discarded. It was now clear, these were not isolated crimes. This was a double homicide, and the killers were still on the loose. Detectives began working backward. Inside the house, DNA evidence was abundant. Bloodstains, fingerprints, and strands of hair would later be matched to the perpetrators. Also found in the home were documents, clothing items, and receipts that pointed to people who had been in the house recently. That's when a name surfaced. Lamarcus Davidson, the man who had been renting 2316 Chipman Street at the time of the crime. Davidson was a known felon, released from prison only months earlier. His record included aggravated robbery, and he was known to associate with a dangerous crowd. With that lead, the manhunt began. On January 11th, the marshals received a tip that Davidson was holed up at a vacant house in Knoxville, not far from the original crime scene. He was arrested without incident, sitting on a couch, unarmed, as if nothing had happened. But Davidson wasn't alone in this horror. Under questioning, additional names surfaced. Latalvis Cobbins, Davidson's half-brother, had been staying with him at the time. Cobbins, too, had a rape history, and his connection to the house was strong. Investigators traced Cobbins and his friend, George Thomas, to Lebanon, Kentucky. Acting quickly, marshals and local authorities raided an apartment there and arrested both men. Vanessa Coleman, Thomas's girlfriend, was also detained at the scene. With those 4 in custody, the puzzle began to take shape. But one piece was still missing: Eric Dwayne Boyd. Inside their temporary jail cells, the suspects began turning on each other. Cobbins confessed first, implicating Davidson as the ringleader and himself as a reluctant participant. He tried to minimize his own role, claiming he only raped Channon under pressure. Thomas's confession mirrored Cobbins's, adding detail but shifting blame. Coleman, in her statements, painted herself as a bystander, scared and unaware of the full extent of the violence. But her own journal, recovered from her bag, had betrayed that narrative. From that point forward, the case gained national attention, not just for the savage nature of the crimes, but for the racial and media dynamics it exposed. But in Knoxville, the city was focused on one thing: justice. The families had answers, but they didn't have peace. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA from multiple men was found on and inside Shannon's body. Fingerprints matched items in the house. Surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements began to form a timeline. One by one, the perpetrators were charged with kidnapping, rape, robbery, and capital murder. The victims' families, who had only days earlier been handing out flyers and praying for a safe return, now found themselves preparing for years of trials. Trials that would reveal horrors no parent should ever have to hear. Long before opening statements, the Knox County Criminal Court saw people lining up outside the courthouse, some out of grief, others out of outrage. It was not just a murder trial. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The Christian and Newsom families, seated in the front rows, had come face to face with the people who had destroyed their lives, and they were prepared to endure every minute of it. The lead prosecutor, Takesha Fitzgerald, opened with a tone of grim determination. She described the night of January 6, 2007, how Channon and Chris were carjacked, held at gunpoint, and taken to 2316 Chipman Street. She explained how Chris was raped, executed, and set on fire. How Channon was tortured, violated, and slowly suffocated. And then she pointed at each defendant, Lamarcus Davidson, Latalvis Cobbins, George Thomas, and Vanessa Coleman, naming them one by one as willing participants in every phase of the horror. The defense, in turn, scrambled to minimize culpability. Lawyers for each defendant leaned on familiar strategies: blame the ringleader, claim coercion, deny knowledge. Davidson's attorneys claimed there was no concrete evidence he personally raped Channon. Cobbins's team said he was scared of his half-brother. Thomas tried to position himself as a passive observer. Coleman's attorney described her as a girl in over her head. But as testimony unfolded, those defenses began to crumble. Then came the forensic experts. DNA testing confirmed that semen from multiple defendants was found in or on Channon Christian's body. Latalvis Cobbins's DNA matched samples from vaginal swabs. Davidson's was found on underwear. George Thomas's DNA was recovered from various items inside the house. The bleach had failed to destroy all evidence. The truth remained. One of the prosecution's strongest witnesses turned out to be Cobbins himself. In a taped confession played for the jury, he admitted to raping Channon, claiming he only did so because Davidson forced him. He also admitted that Chris was taken away and never returned. His tone was flat. There was no emotion in his voice. Just facts, as though describing someone else's crime. Jurors later said they found his demeanor chilling. Then came Vanessa Coleman's journal, which had a written note stating, "I've had one hell of an adventure since I've been in the Big TN. It's crazy." Another entry spoke about staying out of trouble, suggesting she was fully aware something criminal had happened. The prosecution built their case meticulously. Every piece of clothing, every fingerprint, every hair follicle was accounted for. Davidson's palm print was found on the trash bags that held Shannon's body. Thomas's fingerprints were on duct tape. Even food receipts helped place the group in the house on the days in question. Then came the sentencing phase. Lamarcus Davidson was found guilty on all counts. The jury recommended the death penalty, citing the heinous nature of the crimes and the leadership role he played. He showed little emotion as the sentence was read. Latalvis Cobbins and George Thomas were both convicted and sentenced to life without parole. Cobbins's rape conviction and lack of remorse ensured he would never be released. Thomas, though less involved in the murders, was implicated by presence and knowledge. Vanessa Coleman was convicted of facilitating the crimes, not directly committing them. She was sentenced to 53 years, a punishment that sparked both outrage and debate. Some believed she got off lightly. Others said the sentence reflected her more limited, though still disturbing, role. And then there was Eric Boyd. Initially charged only at the federal level for being an accessory after the fact, Boyd served years in prison before being retried by the state. In 2019, he was finally convicted of raping and killing Christopher Newsom, after new testimony and evidence emerged tying him directly to the murder. His conviction brought a bittersweet sense of closure to the Newsom family, who had waited over a decade for justice. Every trial, every ruling, was a punch to the gut for the families. But they endured it. They showed up. They watched. They listened to every detail about how their children were taken from them. And they vowed never to let the story fade. They killed my daughter, but they couldn't kill her name. They couldn't kill the truth. Dina Christian. Despite the monstrous nature of the crime, the Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom case barely registered with most national news outlets when it first broke in 2007. There were no breaking news banners. No long-form specials on cable networks. No nightly news segments dedicating coverage to the grotesque details. For months, the most heartbreaking and horrifying aspects of the double murder went largely unreported beyond Tennessee. For many, this silence was deafening and unacceptable. The question quickly emerged: why was a case so brutally violent and senseless not considered newsworthy on a national scale? Some believed race was at the heart of the media's neglect. Others accused journalists of political selectiveness, an unwillingness to highlight a case that didn't fit an expected narrative. The families of Channon and Chris never openly framed the case in racial terms. They focused on justice, on memory, on pain. But others picked up that baton for them. The gavel had fallen. Verdicts had been read. Sentences had been handed down. And for a brief moment, it seemed like justice had been served. But in the case of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom, the story was far from over. In early 2012, just when the families of the victims had started to come to terms with the weight of their loss, and the long sentences delivered to the 5 perpetrators, the state of Tennessee dropped a bombshell. All of the state convictions were in jeopardy. The reason? A man named Judge Richard Baumgartner. Baumgartner had presided over the original trials for Latalvis Cobbins, Lamarcus Davidson, George Thomas, and Vanessa Coleman. He was a seasoned criminal court judge, and outwardly, he had maintained a composed and commanding courtroom presence throughout the proceedings. But behind the scenes, he was living a double life, one that would come to undermine years of legal work and re-traumatize the Christian and Newsom families. The details were shocking. It came to light that Baumgartner had been abusing prescription drugs, not casually or recreationally, but habitually and recklessly. Worse still, he was buying pain pills from convicted felons, including defendants who had appeared before him in court. In some instances, he allegedly had sexual encounters in his chambers while under the influence. These revelations were uncovered in a sprawling investigation led by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, which found that Baumgartner was, during some of the most important trials of his career, functionally impaired. This raised a disturbing legal question. Could the verdicts rendered under such a judge be considered valid? The Tennessee Supreme Court had to act. Though they did not find that Baumgartner's misconduct had directly affected his rulings in the Christian Newsom case, the appearance of impropriety was enough to trigger sweeping consequences. Meaning the possibility of retrials was now very real. For the families of Channon and Chris, it was like losing their children all over again. "We sat through every day of those trials," Dina Christian said in a tearful press conference. "We saw the evidence. We heard the testimony. We watched those monsters get sentenced. Now we have to do it all over again. Because a judge couldn't control his drug habit." The public reaction was swift and furious. Local radio shows and newspapers were flooded with calls and letters. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse. In 2012, the retrials were officially ordered. The case would have to be relitigated, every horrific detail, every piece of evidence, every gruesome photograph shown again. For the parents, it meant sitting once more through graphic autopsy reports, forensic testimony, and confessions. It meant watching their children die again, this time in a different courtroom. And for some of the defendants, it also meant another shot at a reduced sentence. Latalvis Cobbins and Lamarcus Davidson were the first to challenge the ruling. Their attorneys argued that the retrials were not only unnecessary but unconstitutional. They claimed their client's convictions should stand, regardless of Baumgartner's conduct, because the evidence against them was overwhelming. The Tennessee Supreme Court eventually agreed. Their convictions and sentences were upheld. But for George Thomas and Vanessa Coleman, the situation played out differently. Both were granted full retrials. And both were tried again in front of new juries, new judges, and fresh scrutiny. Coleman's retrial, however, yielded a different result. While she was still convicted of facilitating the crimes, her sentence was reduced from 53 years to 35 years, making her eligible for parole in the 2020s. This decision enraged many in the Knoxville community. To them, Coleman had been an accomplice to evil, aware, complicit, and disturbingly indifferent. Her journal entries, discovered during the original investigation, had painted a chilling portrait of a young woman who not only failed to stop the horror but seemed fascinated by it. This wasn't just about punishment, Gary Christian said. This was about making sure no one forgets what happened to our kids. And she's getting a second chance? That's not justice. Amid these emotional retrials, the judicial system was forced to look inward. Judge Baumgartner, the man at the center of the legal earthquake, was disbarred and convicted of official misconduct. He avoided prison but was sentenced to probation and house arrest. Many believed he got off far too easy. In the years that followed, Tennessee passed a series of laws designed to protect victims' families from being re-traumatized by judicial misconduct. One such bill ensured that victim impact statements would be allowed even in retrials. Another bill, the Christian Newsom Act, aimed to streamline the appeals process for capital cases, reducing the likelihood of endless delays. These legislative victories were small consolations in the face of devastating loss, but they served a purpose. They reminded the world that Channon and Chris did not die in vain, and that the pain their families endured helped make the system better, if only by a little. The Christian and Newsom families, having endured years of court dates, testimony, appeals, and media scrutiny, could have quietly retreated into private mourning. Instead, they became voices for victims across the state and beyond. From speaking at legislative hearings to addressing groups of grieving parents, they took their pain and transformed it into a catalyst for change. "We're not going to let what happened to Channon and Chris be just a headline," said Gary Christian, Shannon's father. "This has to mean something. Their lives have to stand for something." Beyond legislation, memorials began to spring up throughout Knoxville. In 2014, a bench and plaque were installed at the University of Tennessee campus, honoring Shannon's life and spirit. Scholarships were established in both of their names to help local students pursue higher education, an echo of the bright futures that had been so violently stolen. Each year, candlelight vigils are held in their memory. Friends, family members, and supporters gather to share stories, light candles, and reaffirm the promise that Channon and Chris would never be forgotten. Some attendees never knew them personally. Others were close friends. All share in the common mission to honor their memory and ensure their story continues to be told. That mission has also extended into the world of true crime advocacy, where documentaries, podcasts, and articles have kept their story alive for new audiences. Though some early media coverage was criticized for being exploitative or politically driven, many newer efforts have focused squarely on the human impact, highlighting the love these two young people shared, the horror of what they endured, and the resilience of those left behind. One particularly moving moment came in 2015, during a televised interview with Shannon's mother, Dina Christian. When asked what she wanted the world to remember most about her daughter, she paused, wiped a tear, and said, "She was light. She was laughter. She was the kind of person who made you feel better just by walking into a room." Chris was the same. Kind, respectful, full of dreams. That's who they were. Not just victims. The families have endured relentless emotional burdens. Public grief is different from private mourning. Every new documentary brings back the pain. Every parole hearing reopens the wounds. Even the smallest headlines can pull them back into a nightmare they never asked for. Still, they remain present. As the years pass, new true crime stories will emerge. New trials. New headlines. But those who remember Knoxville in 2007 will never forget the way that winter evening changed everything. And they'll remember two families, united by grief, transformed by purpose, who stood up and said, "You will not erase our children." The story of Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom is not just a tragedy. It's a warning, a call for justice, and a testament to the strength of the human spirit. In remembering them, we honor not only their lives, but the fight their families waged so no other family would suffer in silence. Evil may have taken their lives, but it did not erase their light. That light now burns in every voice that refuses to forget. If this story moved you, and you believe these victims deserve to be remembered, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you never miss another true crime case that deserves to be told. Your support helps bring justice, truth, and remembrance to the stories that matter most. Thank you for watching, and I will be seeing you on our next episode.